Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. It seems like we may have folks trickle in, but we might as well get started here and we'll welcome them in when they get here. You are in the workshop on strengthening collaborative data capacity. And we're just going to take a second to introduce ourselves first. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and organization. Any key takeaways you've had from the conference so far, or any fun facts about you. Happy to learn more about all of you. My name is Emily Rusca. I'm Director of State Policy and Strategy at Education Systems Center at Northern Illinois University, one of the 3 network organizers for the Illinois Education and Career Success Network, formerly known as the Illinois 60 by 25 Network. Charlie, you want to jump in and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Rosemond. I'm the Data and Outcomes Manager working with Emily at Ed Systems Center. And I will pass it to Melissa.
Thanks, Charlie. Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Figueira. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with Advance Illinois.
Awesome. So we are excited to have you all here today for this workshop. We will get into some action in a little bit, but I'm going to set a little bit of context before we dive in. I'm just going to sort of generally talk about why using data is important, what we might be able to look at and consider, some sources for data, and how we can start to think about developing and embedding a practice of using data. And Melissa and Charlie are also going to help us think about more deeply about once you have data, what do we do with it? So we're going to go ahead and dive right in, and we're going to get some practice using a protocol virtually a little bit later. So once we get through the initial sort of context. So the first bit here is that what we can use data for when we're thinking about using data in our collaborative practices in our community networks, et cetera. The way we like to think about it is that data serves both as a window that helps us look out to develop insights into what's happening with students, with schools, within our districts, but also as a mirror. So what we're seeing through the data helps us understand what's happening as a result of our own practices and systems that we're putting into place. So there's this duality in terms of when we're using data about kind of different levels of lessons we can learn through the data. I also like to use this question just to help us ground in the purpose a little bit more deeply, which is that we know that sometimes data can be used as a hammer, right? To kind of just say, the district's not doing something right, or this class isn't working, or students aren't doing this or that, using it just as kind of a hammer to critique, as opposed to as a flashlight, which helps us identify areas for both celebration as well as areas for growth. Charlie and Melissa have heard me say this 1,000 times, but if in the middle of the night your lights go out, you're not going to take a hammer, start swinging it around your house. You're going to take a flashlight and you're going to go to the fuse box and figure out what's going on and what might need to be done, what other tools you might need to fix the challenge. So we like to think of it as a flashlight, again, to both identify things that we can uplift and celebrate, as well as areas for growth or further consideration. Data also helps us engage our equity lens. If we don't look at data in a disaggregated way, we're not going to have a deeper understanding about what's happening for different types of students, different communities, different buildings, et cetera. And it helps us understand not only what's going on with different groups of students, but it also helps us see the system a little bit more comprehensively, right? I like to include this visual from the National Equity Project that any system produces what it was designed to produce. So it's really essential for us to think about, again, in using that sort of mirror concept, what is it that we're learning from our data about the systems that we have designed, and how can we design them more equitably to reach different people's needs to help them get where they want to go. So overall, we kind of try to think about this data use theory of action in the context of collaborative work, particularly in education and workforce settings, but this can be applied in many other contexts as well, that it's not just about having data and using it. There's actually a lot more conditions and underlying conditions that we need to consider as we try to use those data. So at the bottom of that pyramid, right, is the quality, capacity, and culture around using data. Quality both being that the data themselves are of quality, but also, the quality of the systems in place to engage with it. And that ties into capacity, both in terms of, do we actually even collect data? Do folks within our team have the skills that they need in order to engage with those data? And that doesn't mean everyone has to be a statistician, but just the ability and the comfort level and building comfort level with engaging with data. And do we have a regular kind of set of practices around using data that contributes to a data use culture? And that's both from the top down, modeling from the top down, as well as from the bottom up, that everyone is expected to engage with data in different ways, and that we regularly gather to engage with those data. When you have those conditions and then set into place actions, the policies, the practice, the programs, the placement policies, et cetera, of using data, like those expectations can help undergird all of the kinds of activities that will help drive increased student achievement. If we're doing this in a regular way, in a way that is consistently centering students and trying to understand better what's happening with them, or with our kind of target audience or our key stakeholders, that can help us drive improved results. So when we talk about building a data muscle, we talk about, again, these kinds of conditions for use, right? That there's a vision for it, that everyone's using, yet that everyone is expected to use data in various ways, and that there's accountability tied to using these data. But also, it's really essential to build relationships and trust. It's not easy to engage with data, particularly across partners. Charlie and I have led a lot of workshops with community partners, and it'll have folks from secondary and post-secondary and community-based organizations. And maybe the people in secondary have a really good understanding of what's happening in their buildings or their district, but they have less of an understanding of what's happening at the post-secondary level, and vice versa. To engage with data from both those systems in the same space can be a really vulnerable space for leaders. And so it's really valuable and essential to have this like collective approach to working with data and building that trust in order to kind of make good on your commitment to improving the experiences and outcomes for students or whoever your stakeholders are. So, it's a process. It's not going to be that you set up one data workshop with your community team and all of a sudden your guys have a great cadence already of using data. It may be that it takes some time, just like building muscles might. The other thing that we'd like to just posit for folks is that, again, not everyone has to be a statistician and not everyone's going to be a statistician, right? So it's important for us to be able to acknowledge and recognize that there's actually a lot of different levels of questions we can consider as we're engaging with data, and that there are different levels of analysis and understanding that all have value. And you got to start somewhere. Again, kind of like building a muscle, building up analysis and understanding might take starting on the ground floor of observation. So just to walk through these different levels, observations are pretty self-explanatory, right? Making just general observations about numbers. This can be saying this number is bigger than that number. This number changed over time. This number is different for this group of students versus this other group of students. Everyone can make observations. And I like to use that as kind of the ground floor because it really does set the table for that, starting to build that muscle and building some confidence and efficacy amongst team members to engage with your data. Relating is starting to try and draw connections between different things that you were able to observe in the data. So, things like, our dual credit enrollment is up and our remediation rates are down, things like that. Starting to say like, okay, as we've been implementing this strategy, we've also simultaneously seen these things happening. And that third level is kind of like, let's make trying to make those concrete assumptions or connections across the data and programs, et cetera. So that would be kind of at this really attractive level where we want to be able to say we did X and this was the clear impact. Sometimes it might be hard to actually get at that level of impact and like inference, but we can start making some building from those observations and relationships that we're able to see in the data into start getting at those inferences. And insights at all of these levels are really valuable. And depending on where you are in a project or an intervention, there may be room for any of these three to kind of fit in. So we like to make sure that we ground in all three levels and build from them as we're engaging with data. So before I hand it off, I'm just going to name, and again, these slides and this recording will be posted on our website, but just some examples of where we can look for data. Our network hosts a dashboard. That dashboard is publicly available. The Illinois School Report Card has a lot of great data. We'll be engaging with some of it a little bit later today. The College to Career site is another good one for data, as well as the Illinois Post-Secondary Profile site. And ISB has been in the process of launching the Equity Learning Continuum. We're going to hear more about that from Superintendent Ayala, actually, in a plenary session, I believe, tomorrow. And so, there's a lot of data that are out there. It's not just about what do you already have in your systems, but there's also a lot in different folks' systems. So I will hand it off from here so that we can dive into what we do once we have data. And just let me know when to advance slides.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. All right, so now you have your data in hand, and the question is, what are you supposed to do with it? How can you actually set the table and equip stakeholders to engage with, process, make sense of, and actually use that data in all the ways that Emily has outlined for us? So I'm going to lay out some of the kind of practical considerations that you can use to think through those questions. So we're going to talk about how you actually choose a data protocol. And then once you have a protocol that's going to kind of guide your conversation, what are some of the practical facilitator things you should think about, like materials, space, how to actually structure the conversation and the questions you ask, depending on the type of group you're talking to. And we'll also talk a little bit about how you can facilitate these kinds of conversations in our increasingly digital world, because we know we're not always in the same room at the same time, as evidenced by this very conference. So the first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is choosing a protocol. And right off the bat, I just want to kind of demystify the word protocol. The way we're using that today is really just to describe a tool or a framework that you can use to help scaffold participants through engaging with your data. So this will be kind of a set of questions or a process that you help them walk through so that they're not just kind of looking at numbers on a spreadsheet or in a chart, but they're actually able to kind of disentangle and make meaning of the data that you're talking to them about. So the first thing you want to do when you decide which type of protocol to use to identify which one is really ideal for your purposes is to look at your data set and think about, why are you initiating this data conversation in the first place? What is the goal that you have for bringing together a group of stakeholders to unpack and engage with your data? And so another way of kind of framing that question in your mind is, what does success look like once your group has engaged with the data? And that can take multiple forms. Your goal could just be to simply explain the data and make sure people are aware of its existence and its meaning at a high level. Or you could go a little further and be hoping to develop a shared understanding so that folks have a common language and they can really enter into discussions that are informed by that data, all coming from a similar level of knowledge. Alternately, you could also be trying to get to a place where you're using that information to inform action. So people can actually take steps or make decisions that are directly informed by or grounded in the patterns or needs that the data reveal to you. So your choice of protocol should really match up with your goals for the conversation. And the data protocol packet that you guys are going to get as part of this session, and it's included in these slides, includes examples of that type of alignment, how you can align your protocol to your goals. So I won't go into the levels of inquiry since Emily did a great job walking us through that already, but I will say that that is really the kind of second side of the coin in choosing the protocol that's right for you and for your conversation. Once you know what your goal is, you're also going to want to think about the level of inquiry that you're trying to get at with the protocol. So we can go to the next slide. Awesome. And so once you are in the facilitator seat, and you're really trying to make sure that you're having a kind of deep conversation with your stakeholders about this data, we can think about several different facets of facilitation in advance. So whichever protocol you've chosen, you want to be really intentional about thinking of the types of questions that you're making sure to ask through that protocol. So we use a quick shorthand called ORID, O-R-I-D, which is just an acronym for those quick 4 bullets at the top, as a reminder of those types of questions that you want to try to get through, in part or in whole during your data conversation. And so those, as you can see laid out here, include, just at the very basic observational level, what's the data telling us? At the deeper reflectional level, what does that mean and how does it relate to our experiences and the other things that we know? Taking it a step further, we can use that to inform interpretation. So what does that actually mean for us now that we've put it in context? And then finally, how can that inform the decisions we make as a group, as a community, as a school moving forward? The other thing that we want to do, and Emily spoke a bit about equity, is making sure that when you're facilitating a data conversation, you really are bringing all voices in. And that's something that it really makes sense to kind of plan for in advance and be intentional about, because we know that when we're setting these data conversations, it can sometimes be intimidating to, sit down with and talk about something that might seem technical, might seem unfamiliar. So you want to make sure that you are making people feel comfortable and that it's an inclusive conversation where kind of every voice feels welcome and valued. Ways that we can do that is make sure that you set aside time for people to do some individual meaning making at first. So have them kind of just sit with and reflect on data, answer some questions, jot down their own notes before asking them to kind of share out in a more public manner. You can also have people get together in small groups, in pairs or in groups of 2 or 3, to kind of talk to a partner in a lower pressure situation. And then finally, either after those 2 things or if it's more appropriate or comfortable, you can then move to kind of a large group conversation where everyone comes into play. You're going to want to think about how you capture the information that happens during the conversation. So it may seem obvious, but it's good to think in advance about having a designated note taker or having your participants respond and kind of enter into the conversation in a way that is already collecting and capturing data for you. So whether that's in person, writing stuff down on actual sticky notes, or kind of, large chart paper, or in a virtual setting, if you can save the Zoom chat or have them kind of take notes in a way that you can see afterwards. And then of course, framing is always incredibly important when you're planning your facilitation approach. So you'll want to make sure that you are opening and closing the conversation intentionally. That means on the front end, making sure that you're stating your goals clearly and providing people with context and the agenda before diving in. And then in the closing, that you're giving them time to kind of reflect on what's happened, really clearly identify any next steps or commitments that are coming out of the conversation, and sharing appreciation. And hopefully we'll model all of that for you guys today. You can go to the next slide. So this just lays out in your protocol packet, you're going to have a few different protocols that you can use to kind of go through these community conversations around data. And this just outlines that ORID framework that I talked to you guys through with the different types of questions laid out against 2 different types of protocols. So one is a gallery walk, where you would have a bunch of data kind of put up around a room, around a physical space, so that people can walk around, process, and react to these questions. The other is kind of a more, stationary way of engaging with data, where you kind of make sure that you're working through each of these levels of questions and then have a conversation about it. We can go to the next slide. All right. So again, I know this might seem obvious, but I think it's incredibly important. It's kind of in the same way you don't want to walk into the grocery store without a list and forget half the things you actually needed. I think it's incredibly important when you're planning these conversations, especially with that inclusion and equity goal in mind, to make sure you have all of these practical considerations taken care of. So you'll want to make sure that you have whatever presentation materials you need, whether it's a slide or data packets, whether it's posters or materials to take notes on. And then you're going to want to make sure that you have ways for people to engage. So again, in an in-person space, this can be some way for people to write their thoughts down that you can either collect or let them keep at the end of the day, or kind of, reflection materials, thought starters, stuff for them to be able to record their thoughts. And then finally, space. And I think Charlie will talk a little bit about, space was a consideration, it hopefully will be a consideration in kind of hybrid or in-person context, but we also have some kind of digital options that you can think about. But if you are lucky enough to be facilitating this type of conversation in person, you're going to want to think about your seating arrangements, any audiovisual kind of, considerations, just to make sure that everything works and everyone can actually be engaged the whole time. Next slide. Awesome. And then the last couple of considerations we have as you're planning your facilitation is just about group size. You can maybe skip the parent share or small group stuff if you have a small group to begin with. If your full group is not huge, then you might not need to do that kind of smaller grouping. The other thing is that you're going to want to be really conscious going into your conversation about the group dynamics. So if there's already a high level of trust and familiarity among the members of your group, you may not need to spend as much time kind of level setting and providing context and making sure people are able to comfortably relate to each other as you would if you were bringing together a group of new stakeholders who have never met or talked about this data before. So you'll think about whether they have prior experience collaborating, who knows who, and just who's at the table. So you're aware of the different levels of authority and hierarchy and any dynamics that might be at play that you as a facilitator will need to make sure that you navigate carefully. And then finally, number of facilitators. You know, if you do have a very large group and you're going to want to do something like breakouts, it's generally good to think about having one facilitator for every, I would say about 8 to 10 folks at max, so that you can make sure that you're really optimizing your conversation. Next slide. All right, and so this is just a summary of all the things we just went through. Make sure that when you're choosing your protocols and engaging with your data, you start with a clear goal, you formulate questions that really get at each of those different levels of inquiry that we talked about, structure your conversation so that you're really making sure to call all voices in and make sure that everyone's thinking can be heard. You're preparing and sharing any relevant materials, so really making sure that you're ready ahead of time, and then documenting next steps and assigning tasks.
One thing I'll just add here, and thanks, Melissa. One thing I'll just add when we're just to drive home the point of ensuring all voices are being brought in. One way to do that, like a just transparent facilitator move, is to just have the first way people engage or contribute ideas to be individually before folks start sharing, right? So like having folks, even if you're in person, say, and you're working on everyone's working on the same kind of here's what, so what, now what worksheet, having them individually think and write down their initial ideas and observations in that first question before beginning to start having conversations across the group or even in pairs. Because in that way, it helps them kind of not be anchored to other people's observations, but rather kind of build their own sort of self-efficacy as they're working through it.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That is an excellent kind of facilitator trick to have in your back pocket. And so this chart just takes us through a quick rundown of the different protocols that we provided for you guys today in your packet. What it kind of shows you is not just a description of what each of the protocols is at a high level, but also the group size that it's appropriate to use them for and the takeaways that you can hopefully get out of them. So just quickly, the here's what, so what, now what allows participants to just move through those 3 simple questions about what they have in front of them, what does that mean, and based on that meaning, what next steps should they be taking. It's great for small groups, so less than 6 people. And it's really simple, and you can also just build on it and adapt it as needed for your context. So that's a great first one to get started with. In the placemat, people gather around one kind of big placemat that sets up the data conversation and allows them to share their insights. This is also a good one with small groups because you're kind of all looking at the same piece of evidence. Or you can use breakout rooms in a larger group. And it's ideal for understanding, you know, data sets that are not necessarily in the same system, but might be related to one another and kind of processing how that relation works. Like I said before, a data walk is kind of where you set up pieces of data around a space and have people kind of walk up to them, look at them, think about them, digest, and then reflect on Post-it notes or in conversation with one another. This is really great for a large group because it allows people to kind of process at their own pace and then with their colleagues as well. It's also a really great way to kind of have people come together to talk about equity and equity gaps. ORID, we already talked through the different levels of questions, objective, reflective, interpretation, and decisional. Also good for small groups or large groups with breakouts. And then finally, the 5 whys. So if you have a kid or you know a kid, I think this is a great tool that kids unconsciously use on us all the time, which is that you ask the question why, and then you just keep on asking it until you go deeper and deeper into kind of really unpacking and understanding the question you're trying to get at. I think I'm going to kick it over to Charlie to take us through what this all means in the virtual world.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And just a note, I dropped in the chat the protocol packet that I think all of us have now mentioned. So that provides a bit more detail into a lot of that information that Melissa was just going through in terms of these different considerations in choosing a protocol, but also a small set of protocols that we found a lot of value in. But in terms of this virtual context that, we have this virtual conference, we have kind of been living in it for some time now. Just wanted to share a few kind of different platforms that we at Systems and our partners have used to great effect lately. Today we'll be using Google Jamboard. We've also found a lot of benefit from Miro. Emily mentioned earlier strategic use of Google Forms. It's kind of Baskin Robbins. There are a ton of flavors out there. Just kind of find what works for you and for your organization and for a specific protocol. But I think in general, anything that offers like a whiteboard function can be valuable. The means to kind of engage your attendees through polling. I think we've found it's ideal when there's kind of integration between whatever platform you're using and kind of other systems. Like if you use Microsoft, perhaps Microsoft Teams, if you use G Suite, Google Jamboard, integrates with Google Drive. So it's really just finding whatever kind of platform and tool works for you, your organization, for your specific purpose. So next slide, Emily. Which kind of brings us back to facilitation. And I think kind of the same kind of key considerations come up here virtually as they would in person. And, I think when we're considering data, there's a question of when to provide data. Are you providing these kind of data points prior to a meeting, during the meeting? It all kind of depends upon your audience, but also your intents. Balancing that individual reflection with group dialogue. Again, as Melissa noted, really considering group size and group dynamics here and what you're trying to accomplish. But I think striking that balance between the individual and group is key. As Emily mentioned, trying to ensure inclusive participation. Just in general, this conference equity first. I think if we are prioritizing having folks at the table, we need to ensure that they feel included and can participate, as best they see fit. Progressively deepening, those questions towards inquiry. Perhaps you are interested in something maybe a bit more observational or descriptive, or you feel like you want to dive deeper to, inference. I think it all depends, but you can frame your kind of conversation around how deep you want to go. And then kind of as always, really any meeting, what are our takeaways? What are our next steps? How are we documenting those and also communicating them to all of our attendees to ensure that, we can keep the work moving ahead. So with that, next slide, Emily. We are going to shift to action. So today we are going to practice a specific protocol, and you go ahead and keep it moving, Emily. Thank you. Going to practice a specific protocol. Here's what, so what, now what, but wanted to present these just kind of 5 goals to all of y'all before we get started. So, we're hoping to kind of practice developing a shared understanding of some metrics of interest, in this case, dual credit enrollment rates here in Illinois. We're going to practice observing and also interpreting data. So what are we seeing in the data? What are kind of the implications? What do these data mean? Going to consider like the narratives around these data. So implications, but how might we kind of act upon these data moving ahead? Like this is what we observe. This is what it means to us in our context. But now what? What are we going to do now that we have these data? And kind of to that end, practice identifying, strategies to act upon the data, in response to the data. And then again, implications, like how can we continue to practice bringing data into our decision-making processes, like via these protocols, but also just in general. So next slide. Which brings us to here's what, so what, now what. So this was one of that group of protocols that Melissa had shared prior, but it's really about reviewing a single data set and just reflecting on a set of 3 simple prompts. Here's what, so describing what you see in the data using just like facts, like pure kind of reactions, observations. So what are the implications for me and my role, for my organization, for our kind of broader community or our group of stakeholders? And then now what? So what is one thing that I will do, that our organization or community can do as a result of these data or in response to these data? And so here's what, so what, now what, I think we found valuable in general for its simplicity, for its kind of applicability with individuals, kind of groups as well, kind of a mix of the two. But it also hits on kind of those levels of inquiry, or it can. It really can be applied as deeply as you want it to go, but it's really moving from observation to kind of more interpretation, or perhaps inference, again, towards like ultimately acting upon the data.
And even if that action sometimes is like, we want to look at more detailed information about this particular metric or what have you.
Right. So go ahead, Emily. I was going to drop the data. Okay. Yeah. So I am going to drop the data in the chat. Please let me know if you cannot access those data.
Yeah. So what we're going to do here, Charlie's dropping the data in the chat so everyone will have access to it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to get into, I think let's see. I think we're going to do 2 breakout rooms, and then we'll do, we'll drop a Jamboard in the chat in just a second. We'll do a Jamboard of here's what, so what, now what. It'll probably be about 15 minutes, and then we'll kind of come back together all right, it looks like we are all back here. Thanks for participating in a very fast and furious data protocol. I'm sure, I know I said to my group, but I'm sure Charlie and Melissa said to their group, this is not the recommended length of time. 15 minutes is not the recommended length of time for working through a complete protocol. That said, hopefully you got a good taste for what it's like to engage with those data, what it's like to kind of have a structure for your conversation. And maybe even it sparks some interest in, knowing that those are publicly available data, and knowing that those data might be available for your community area, or where you do your work. It maybe inspires you to look at your data a little bit differently or dig in. But couple things I'll note. We'll drop the protocol packet into the chat again. The protocol packet has recommendations around time for the various protocols. Certainly it's not hard and fast rules, but there's a lot of rationale behind those recommendations. I think I shared in my group that it's often really beneficial to have a lot of front end reflection, individual or paired reflection, so that you're generating as many observations as possible before kind of diving into the inferences and relational questions. Just that way you're surfacing as many ideas as possible. So you may have kind of like an uneven distribution of time across the questions, but wanted to turn it to the group here and just welcome any reflections folks might have. These are some prompts. You don't have to use any of these prompts to start your reflection, but any sort of ahas in the process of engaging with this, or kind of residual questions you might have, or things you're maybe excited to adapt and apply in your own context.
I really enjoyed the Jamboard. I've used those, but not on a regular basis. So I'm excited to try stuff like that, because of course we're all getting bored with just having conversations. And then that's you've been able to document what we talked about through the Jamboard without taking additional notes. So that was awesome. And I thought it was a great activity for introverts and not allowing some people to dominate the conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, the documentation is key. And I know, as Melissa was describing earlier, like how you bring out various people who may or may not be kind of the normally most vocal people is kind of, as a facilitator, challenging, but having tools like this can be really inclusive in that way. Any other reflections or questions as we start to close out here? All right, well, hopefully this has been a useful session for everybody. Just thanks, huge shout out to my colleagues, Charlie and Melissa, for their collaboration in this. Huge shout out to all of you for being a part of it. You didn't know, I mean, I know we called it a workshop, but you probably didn't know that you were going to have to be as actively participating as you did. But thanks so much for a great workshop. Stay in touch, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you through the network.
Thanks, everyone.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I came on about 5 minutes late, and I wanted to know, did you all list like sources of data besides the school report card? Could you go back and so that I can
sure, and all of the
that
materials, the recording from the session will be made available, and all the materials will be made available. But some of the sources that we highlighted included the dashboard for our network here, includes a report card, the post-secondary profiles site, Illinois College to Career. And I know that ISB is working on sort of additional sort of equity data resources as well.
And it'll be great to have the links to all of those.
Yeah,
okay,
all
wonderful.
of them are embedded in the site, or will be embedded in the sort of PDF of the slides for folks to be able to easily access. For sure.
Great. And thank you. Go ahead.
No. If you have any questions about any of them, I think we're fairly familiar with all of them, but we can also connect you with folks who are experts. So just let us know if you have any questions about those sources.
Wonderful. And thank you for sending the protocols in our district. We do gallery walk a lot.
Yeah.
We've done Jamboard too, but it's great to have that documented so that you can use it as well. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, there's so many different ways to do it. Gallery walks can be super powerful. And also, like when you're trying to get to a different stage with the conversation, some of the other protocols might be more helpful, but like gallery walks are such a powerful tool to communicate with larger groups and like community members, obviously, especially as well. And for those of you who are still on the line, we are going to be doing at 3 o'clock, we're going to be doing a data plenary where we're going to be just reflecting on some state level and network data and hearing from some communities about what they've been doing that has resulted in their wonderful outcomes. So definitely encourage folks to join for that. And tomorrow we've got a session on the equity journey continuum in the morning with Dr. Ayala, and that's definitely going to be worth folks' time. I mean, all the sessions are worth folks' time, but I'll just name those specifically because they're relevant to the conversation we've had this afternoon.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being a part of the session. Thanks, everyone.
Sure.